Creating a brand new zoo on underdeveloped land from scratch is definitely a challenge, but not in the way that you might think. Gazing upon this untouched landscape, we have an abundance of creativity. The problem is creativity is free, the application of it is not. The sudden, yet ultimately successful mass evacuation of the Orchid City Zoo is certainly a thorn in our company's side. Right now, we have absolutely no profit flow. We don't have any money. Luckily, due to very generous donations from locals in a growing community, we recently started construction on a new zoo. So far, we have a beautiful plaza. Unfortunately, a plaza isn't what gets people to spend money at a zoo. We need to find a way to get animals in here, fast. Luckily, our amazing staff has been working day in and day out to master the art of zookeeping. We've had a few hiccups on the way, but once our doors open to the public, there's no doubt in my mind that our staff will be ready and rise to the occasion. Speaking of hiccups along the way and financial burdens, in the last episode, we made this beautiful gift shop. Unfortunately, our inventory manager made the mistake of fully stocking it and getting a lot of backup supplies before the zoo even opened. We need to get this zoo moving to avoid this from being a devastating mistake that could make us close our doors forever. Despite the financial challenges we're currently facing, there's no doubt in my mind that we're going to be able to get this zoo right to where it needs to be in a timely and efficient manner. I am getting a little bit sick of calling it our zoo or the zoo though. I officially welcome you to Keystone Park. A keystone species is an animal or organism that holds an ecosystem together. This is an absolutely perfect name for our zoo. Since we're low on cash right now, we're going to have to rely on local wildlife for our first few animals. Nearby game wardens have recently reported a pair of timber wolves causing chaos in local woods. This will be an excellent start. If you guys are enjoying the series so far, and are really excited to see Keystone Park get its first animal today, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm recording this on Thanksgiving, so I just wanted to say now, even though this will be uploaded later, how thankful I am for you guys and this wonderful community. It's imperative that we get guests in this zoo as soon as possible. However, if we don't do it strategically, our zoo is bound to fail. We have a restroom, we have a gift shop, and we have a good entrance. Now the only thing that's missing from the start is a place to eat and drink. I think that this is going to be the perfect spot for it. Luckily, we didn't plant anything here in the last episode. Typically, zoos will open in the morning, so a coffee shop seems like a perfect thing to have in case guests are still a little bit tired upon entering. My main aesthetic goal while building this was to make it as similar to the entrance as possible. The only thing we did slightly differently, mainly to do the complexity meter a favor, was use a preset wood for the wall of the building. It's an incredibly easy and relaxing build. The only kind of difficult part is blending in the limestone roof of the wooden walls. Adding the gutters in can be a little bit tedious, but the little details truly are what make builds special. Our staff needs to pick up a shipment of wood for the front of the building. For now, let's work on the back. While our staff is busy unloading the shipment, I think it's only fair that we actually give them a door to enter this coffee shop to work in. This was surprisingly difficult. This small path took 15 minutes. Luckily, connecting the two curbs keeping the plant bed out was a little bit easier. This didn't take long at all. After fixing up the curb, I decided to then add the door for the staff. I also added a couple of picnic benches, as well as some normal benches, to make it a convenient area to take a break. The shipments finally came with the company's logo, Bernie Bakes, as well as Street Fox Coffee. These are two very popular and well-known brands, perfect for the start of the zoo. So far so good, although these plant beds are looking a little bit empty. That's a lot more like it. The plants make this zoo look so much more inviting at the start. Thick shrubbery is also a great way to stop guests from seeing areas of the zoo you don't want them to see, like this staff area we can revamp now. If you don't like the look of a path, or anything on the floor for that matter, you can actually use roof pieces and sink them into the path. If you do it low enough, guests and staff will actually still be able to use the path like normal. This is by far the easiest way to get around the pretty much all the times janky path system in Planet Zoo. If you have an awkward area like this, you can simply just not use a path. Your guests and staff won't be able to walk there, but it looks really good from this angle. You just have to make sure it doesn't burst through the buildings like this. If this is the case, just stop editing on the same group and make a separate one. By utilizing two separate grids, you can get really satisfying angles like this one here. This was actually my first time using limestone dyed gray as the floor, and I think it looks really good. Leagues better than the traditional path, and a lot better than the staff path too in my opinion. Our staff must be some messy eaters, because their break area is attracting some local wildlife to the zoo for the first time. Keystone Park is extremely close to having everything we need to open. The only problem is, there's this big open field here and there should be a parking lot there. Cutting about 45 minutes of footage, we now have this, and it looks pretty good, although I think we can do a little bit better. So far it's completely all for show, except for these two recolored buses. These are our guest spawners, where the guest will come from. Eventually I decided to add one more tiny expansion. In this loop right here, this is going to be an animal hospital. Eventually the animals from Orchid City are going to make a comeback, and we're going to need a very state-of-the-art place to treat them. In this space right here is just going to be for a simple school. Building this giant parking lot certainly didn't help our financial situation, although it will in the long run once the zoo is profitable. The more parking space, the more guests. Due to the financial situation, like I said before, we're going to have to target local wildlife first. This means we're starting with North America, and we're actually not building for the timber wolf first, although it is in this video. Easily the hardest part about this game to me doesn't involve anything with building, it's all the planning. Specifically, where to put your starter animal, because you don't want them so close to the entrance of the zoo that you see the coolest thing first, but you also don't want them so far back that you'll never find it. I also want our North American section to start off with something incredibly memorable. We're going to be building a bridge over a nice lake that houses some birds off the workshop. These birds are by far the coolest thing that's on the workshop currently. Since to my knowledge, Console Edition doesn't have access to mods, this is as good as we're going to get. So we're going to be making a lake full of a bunch of them. Since this isn't technically a real habitat, despite it being our first actual habitat, I know it's confusing, we don't have to abide by any exhibit rules. We just have to make it completely from scratch. Adding this bridge that goes over the lake is going to allow us to mess with the elevation a little bit, and stop this North American section from being completely flat. This is really helpful for me as a builder in particular, because that's a pitfall I commonly fall into. This is turning out to be an absolutely perfect entrance into North America. From here currently, the birds are only going to be on the north side of this pond. This exhibit isn't going to have a backstage or anything too fancy, just a brown picket fence. Since the end of the bridge is a little bit taller than the front, that means we can simply blend in the fence to the natural environment. I decided to use the auto paint tool for now. We'll come back later, but this gives the cliffs a pretty realistic look, and lets us know where we're going to put the rocks later. I only want the birds to be able to go on the north side of this lake, so I decided to add some fences under the bridge just in case some try to get crafty. Since the natural barrier on the east side of the exhibit is actually doing a very good job of keeping the birds where we don't want them to go, all we have to do now is add a few more fences and rocks and the exhibit is actually done. By exhibit done, of course I just meant the barrier. We still have a lot of foliage. This bridge is also, unfortunately, horrendously ugly. Let's fix that. It's kinda crazy to me how good you can make a build look while literally only using 4 separate items. It all came from the Twilight pack except the mesh. Now it's time to pretty up the build, and the first thing I thought about adding was a little fountain here. We can use the sprinkler enrichment item despite it not being used as actual enrichment since the birds aren't real, but it'll get the effect done. I wanted to add a small dock relatively close to the surface of the water in case any baby birds have any trouble getting out. Water birds like ducks and geese love to eat off the bottom of riverbeds, so we're going to be adding a lot of plant life down there to keep them happy. Some of it's floating to get the effect that it's peeking through the surface of the water, but we'll add so much that nobody would ever notice. If you're ever trying to make a North American body of water look a little bit more realistic, trust me, coming from experience, just add about 500 common water lilies. It'll do the job very well. Common reeds at the water's edge is also an incredibly simple, yet very effective detail. This can also stop the birds from getting where you don't necessarily want them to go, since their hitboxes are huge. Trying to keep this build as realistic and as authentic as possible, I'm only going to be using plants from the region. That means only North American plants can be here, with the exceptions of vines and other plants that are only used for detailing. This makes it a little bit difficult to use the trees that I want, because right now we have to use a lot of trees and various bushes to make sure that guests can't necessarily see past this exhibit. There's nothing there right now, but eventually there's probably going to be a backstage or even a behind-the-scenes look at a different exhibit, and we don't want guests to be able to see that from here, so we're going to have to get creative on how we place the plants. We're going to have to sink some into the ground, place some thick bushes and shrubbery, and make sure this fence is almost invisible. It's still going to be there, so the birds won't actually be able to walk through it, however hopefully the guests won't be able to see it as much. This is the bird pack I downloaded off the workshop, and again, just to reiterate, I didn't build any of these. What I am going to be doing is taking the birds from this blueprint and moving them over to the exhibit. We're going to be using a loon or two, maybe some herons, some geese, and some ducks of varying genders. Great news! With the success of our waterbird pond, we were actually able to allocate funds and start construction on the timberwolf habitat. Speaking of the timberwolves, we have 2 in our possession now. The mischievous duo the game wardens tipped us off about are safely in our possession. Now we just need to build them an excellent habitat. In order to accomplish this, we're going to have to use the Zoopedia, an invaluable resource for beginner and expert zookeepers alike. Referring to the Zoopedia often is key for your zoo's success. The General Information tab doesn't have anything too crucial on it. The most interesting thing to me is the population and the wild statistic, but let's get into the real information. The Natural Habitat page is arguably the most important. In the middle, it shows the natural habitat range of the animal in the real world. It's highlighted in the pink. The right side is what we're interested in for building a habitat, however. This is where the minimum habitat requirements are located, and you'll need to know these. The Species Data tab is equally as important, although not for the same reasons. For example, we have 2 timber wolves coming into the zoo, a male and a female, and it looks like the minimum group size is 2. Anything less than this, so basically they don't like being solitary, and anything more than 12 would not be acceptable, and the wolves wouldn't like it. Every animal's different. Research status typically affects franchise mode more often than sandbox mode, which is what we're playing on currently. In sandbox mode, by default, all of your research is already done for you, but in franchise mode, you actually have to earn all of these habitat enrichment items and dietary options. To each his own though. Personally, I like playing sandbox more, as it allows you to be more creative right off the bat. The final page of the Timberwolf tab, Interspecies Enrichment, lets you know if any animals can have cohabitation. In this case, they can't with the Timberwolves. This typically will affect African species, more often than not. This is the wolf enclosure at the Columbus Zoo, and although they're not Timberwolves located in here, it's very close. I'm gonna try to mimic the materials that this build is made out of, mainly the vines on the wood, and the chain link fence surrounding the exhibit. It's very simple, but gets the job done. Perfect for a starter enclosure. Similar to the Waterbird Lake that we already built, the natural barriers and constraints sort of let us know where the rough outline of the exhibit is already going to be. For this reason, I decided to start off with the viewing platform, which typically I wouldn't do until last, or at least midway through the build. It's very simple, just some glass and some wood beams protecting it as of now. The wood beams are strictly here as support for the glass. The glass would look really unnatural if it was just standing freely, and I decided to use these Planet Zoo beams that we used on the entrance building and our Street Fox coffee to give some cohesion throughout the exhibits in the zoo. I want everything to look like it's part of the same company. After I got the viewing area to a point where I was happy with it, I then duplicated it entirely as it was and moved it to a second area so we could have 2 viewing platforms. It was slightly difficult to link up the 2 platforms. All we had to do is use some of the Planet Zoo beams, stack them up vertically, and just connect them. It took a little bit of time since there were so many of them to do, but overall it wasn't so bad. I made a nice custom fence out of some metal pieces. Originally I had planned just to use the basic chain link barrier in the Barriers tab, however then I realized it was only a straight line going up and down and didn't necessarily have this overhang that we needed. Wolves can jump and in some occasions climb. According to the Zoopedia, we need some pretty heavy-duty barriers to keep them in, so I wasn't really sure the chain link would look good and be practical. This is going to work fine. This is a fortress. You need 2 things to make a legitimate habitat, and the first one of the 2 we can add right now, and this is a gate. It's found under the Barriers tab, and you can scroll over to the right to find it. They're surprisingly easy to place and use. The only problem is you have to deal with the pathing system once you do place it, but it's really not that bad with these. After a while, I got kinda bored of placing down the chain link fence, and that's not a problem. We'll come back to it later, but for now I just want to mix it up a little bit so I don't get burned down on this project. Before, I mentioned that you need 2 things to make a legitimate habitat, and the first one is the habitat gate. The second thing you need to do is use an actual in-game barrier and connect it to both sides of the gate. When I say in-game barrier, there are a few preset options. There's a brick one, a concrete one, a wood, chain link, even hedge. These are incredibly good items for beginners to use. However, today we're going to be focusing on using the null barrier. And effectively what the null barrier is an invisible wall that the animals can pass through. However, it does allow the habitat to be legitimate. They can't, however, pass through the chain link fence that we already made with items in the construction tab. But since the null barrier runs outside of it, this makes it so our completely custom barrier actually works in the mechanics of the game. All we have to do is connect the null barrier to the habitat gate, and anything inside of it that the animals can't pass through is now effectively the new gate. Alright, we just connected the habitat to both sides, and as you can see, it says ready right under habitat 4. That means we did it right. And just like that, Keystone Park has its very first animal. This is so exciting. Right now his enclosure looks more like a holding cell, however. We'll have to get on that. First, there's one really important thing that we have to do first. Whenever you get a new animal of any kind, no matter how large or small, you always need to check its traversable area. To find that, you go on the heat maps. There's a ton of different things on here. You have staff happiness, and it doesn't look like this guy's happy for some reason, despite not having work today. You have regular happiness, education coverage, security and crime, that shows where our cameras are. We have negative impact on guests, all facilities, power, and it looks like we're going to need a generator out here by the wolf enclosure. You have water, which shows your cleanliness, temperature, and finally traversable area. Simply click the animal, and if you see any red in its enclosure, it means it can escape. Luckily, this enclosure is airtight. According to the Zoopedia, timber wolves are very confident around humans, and what this means is that it's very rare that they'll be subjugated to stress. However, just because this is the case, doesn't necessarily mean I want their exhibit to be viewed from all angles. In order to fix this, we're going to need to plant a lot of trees and foliage around the exterior of the chain link fence, but in order to do this, we're going to need a retaining wall made out of some rocks, so all we have to do is line the coastline of this lake, and then bam, it's done. Along the south side fence, there is a particularly large area that I didn't necessarily want to keep the repetitive rock pattern up with, so I decided to use some mulch and place the rocks at the base of it. This will give us much more room to plant some larger trees. The build definitely looks a lot more sturdy now, which was the plan. Now we can come in with the foliage and help the wolves. After placing literally one tree, I had a really cool idea. I decided to use these Waterfall cliff pieces that came out in the aquatic pack. I'm not sure if it was a part of the free update where the animal's allowed to deep dive, or the actual aquatic pack itself, I'll need checked on that. But anyways, I decided to use this to make a really convincing waterfall that flows into our lake of our waterfowls, starting at the Timberwolf stream, which is up here. This gives the water a realistic flow, which I'm quite proud of. I really like how this entire exhibit turned out, and I encourage you guys to stay around to the end of the video to see the final product. Now that we have this stream carved out, the wolf enclosure was actually much easier to detail up. Now that we had a place to start, it was a lot less daunting. Since this is meant to be the same location as the Waterfowl lake, just with fences to prevent the wolves from getting in there, we detailed it up in the exact same way, using the exact same terrain tricks and rocks and plants. After completing our self-imposed side quest, it was finally time to go back to placing foliage around to stop the wolves from getting stressed. However unlikely it may be. The unsung hero of this build, and low-key one of the most underrated plants in the entire game, are these bramble bushes. They look incredibly nice when merged into rock. It looks like a moss of sorts. I needed a small break from placing foliage, so I decided to then work on the riverbed. If you ever get bored in something in Planet Zoo, or anything in general, it's okay to take a break. You don't necessarily have a time crunch, unless you're playing challenge mode, or you have to upload to keep your YouTube subscribers happy. I kept placing foliage and rocks until the last area that was undetailed was the bottom part of the peafowl lake. Remember, the birds can't get over here, so we don't necessarily have to make this safe for them, we just have to make it detailed enough to make it fit into the zoo. To do this, I made it match the other side. I used a lot of common water lilies and added some basic fencing. At this point you can hardly see the wolf enclosure, which is exactly what I was going for. But now we have to work on the viewing area, where we want you to see them from. I ended up making this build a lot more complicated than I really wanted it to. We started off by taking simple pieces that we already used to make the rough outline of the shape. The problem is, the shape we ended up choosing was rather complicated to build the roof for, but we'll get there. After I was successful in covering the outline of the path with wood, I decided then to add some supports to the top so we could hang vines from them later. Naturally, what we do to one side we must do to the other. This is where the build got pretty challenging. It's such an awkward shape for a roof, despite me liking it, I had absolutely no idea how to fill the space. At first I thought a triangle would work, harkening back to geometry class, but even that didn't work. I really had no idea what to do. I eventually figured out a plan. When in doubt, give up and come back to it later. I decided to do the floor. Some areas of the floor were a little bit awkward and came popping out. I decided then to use some tundra rocks and mix in some temperate rocks with them to blend it into the environment. There's not many rocks here now, but eventually there will be. Continuing my task to avoid doing the roof for as long as possible, I decided to give the interior a log cabin-esque design. I used a lot of tree bark pieces, and a lot of stray branches. I even tried to make this bench custom and cover up the back of it so it looked a little bit different. After a lot of sketching, planning, and pain, I eventually decided a way I could do the roof relatively easily, and that was completely change the design of it. I added an open section. This fundamentally changed the shape of the roof, and made it a lot easier to work with. Instead of one giant roof, I was now working with two smaller ones. This was surprisingly manageable. Eventually, after still a lot of trial and error, this is the design I came up with. It's very simple, but I like it that way. We still have a lot of room on the interior to put some education items and some signs. First I want to finish the outside of the exhibit though. We need to give our Timberwolves some items to stimulate themselves and be entertained by. These are called enrichment items, and are crucial to the game. The Zoopedia will tell you specifically what your animal needs. However, all animals in the game, including reptiles, which don't need much, require two types: toy enrichment items and food enrichment. The Timberwolves fancy this bamboo feeder, and this is a food enrichment item since it feeds them. However, that chew toy we just placed doesn't have any food in it, so it's a toy item. The more animals you add to your enclosure, including juvenile and offspring animals, the more enrichment that you'll need. Most food enrichment items have to be manually replaced by a zookeeper, so you have to make sure they're in areas that are accessible. We'll talk more about how to manage your parks later, but for now, since we only have this one exhibit, we can do whatever we want. This has absolutely nothing to do with the in-game enrichment items. However, I wanted the wolves to be able to have some elevation in their exhibit. I didn't want them to live in a super flat world. At the base of this small hill, I added some low ground. Originally I was going to make this a den for them and have some hard shelter, but I eventually scrapped the idea. However, I did like how it looked, so I kept the low ground in. Naturally, after completing all of the elevation requirements for this exhibit, I then decided to use some terrain. One terrain tip that I really like to use and don't necessarily see a lot of other people using is 1. Combine your terrain with others. I really like the look of the fine sand mixed with the light soil. It makes it look like the animals travel along the path. Once the terrain was completed, it was time to come back in and complete the foliage. I really like using the buffalo grass and merging it with the terrain grass. It makes a really cool effect, and hopefully the Timberwolves like it too. After I finished placing all of the buffalo grass, I then decided to find a tree that would look really good in the center of the exhibit. I didn't really want the shadow to be cast in a spot that would disrupt the view, but eventually I found a tree that was just the perfect height to not let this happen, and look good in the exhibit. I used these pretty large bushes to blend the hill into the low ground, and I really like the effect. Sinking plants into the ground makes them look a lot better, and it doesn't really change the hitbox all that much. The exhibit was looking incredibly green and brown, which isn't a bad thing, that's nature, but I wanted to add a patch of goldenrod just to spruce up some color. I then came by with some various bushes, including the bramble bushes I've grown fond of using, to lastly blend the chain link fence into the wall. I think the only two creatures that are happier with this exhibit than me are our two Timberwolves. We have a male and a female, by the way. Normally I would ask the comments for name suggestions, but I think I'm going to take this one myself. These two rescues are a perfect start for the Keystone Park Zoo. On the inside of the exhibit, I went for a less is more approach. I also think it turned out quite well. I stopped any of the vines from coming inside of the exhibit. I didn't really like how that looked. Since this is our first exhibit, I wanted it to look as clean and pristine as possible. Overall, I think this first exhibit was a complete success. We didn't just accomplish the first exhibit in this episode, we actually got a ton done now that I think about it. Even though the holiday was yesterday, you can be thankful any day, and this community is certainly something to be thankful for. Kingpin out. See you soon.